Well, welcome to this week's Gospel Bible video. I will be in the Boundary Waters on the canoe trip with the high school kids this week, but I'm very pleased that Deaconess Ruth Schmidt will preach at both the Thursday evening and Sunday morning services. And the Gospel text for these services continues our journey through the Gospel of Mark. And this week we hear the story of the death of John the Baptist and how this ties into the ministry and life and even the death of Jesus. As Jesus' fame continued to grow, he came to the attention of King Herod. Now, this is not the same King Herod in Matthew's account of Jesus' birth, the King Herod who kills the innocent children in Bethlehem as he sought to destroy the one who had been born king of the Jews. It's not him, but one of his sons. After King Herod's death around 4 BC, his kingdom was divided among his 4 sons who were called tetrarchs, which is a Greek word meaning 4 rulers. The sons followed their father's ways of being cruel rulers, and things tended to be a bloody mess much of the time when they were in power. I don't have time to go into all the gory details of each of the sons, but one of them, named Herod Antipas, was the ruler of Galilee during the ministry of Jesus. His palace was at a place called Caesarea Philippi, not far north of the Sea of Galilee, and we had an opportunity to visit there on our trip to Israel in 2013. Herod heard about Jesus, and also that some people were saying that in Jesus, and here's the quote from the Gospel, John the Baptizer had been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers were at work in him. We're told that other people were saying Jesus was the great Old Testament prophet Elijah or one of the prophets from of old. But Herod believed, and here's what the Gospel says, John whom I beheaded has been raised. And with that sentence, we go back in time in a little gospel flashback to hear the story about the arrest, imprisonment, and execution of John the Baptist. John, whom we met in passing back in chapter 1 of the gospel, had come calling the people to repent of their sins and be baptized. He was a charismatic figure, the one, again, with the strange attire and who ate locusts and honey, the strange charismatic figure who attracted large crowds just as Jesus would do a short time later. And John also aroused the anger and vengeance of Herod Antipas. Herod had used his position and power to force his own brother Philip to divorce his wife. Her name was Herodias, and Herod Antipas wanted her for himself. And being more powerful than his brother Philip, he got his way. Just one more terrible ruler using threats and power for his own sinful purposes. John the Baptist did not let this violation of the commandments against adultery and coveting go unnoticed. He boldly proclaimed to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." Herod didn't like being told what he could and could not lawfully do, so he sent men to arrest John and threw him in his palace dungeon. Yet he didn't execute him. You see, Herod Antipas feared John the Baptist. He knew John was, as the gospel tells us, a righteous and holy man. He even protected John in prison. John's stance perplexed Herod. He hated him, yet he liked to go down to the prison and listen to what John had to say. It strikes me as a case where Herod knew John was right, that he had sinned and was living in an adulterous relationship, but he couldn't publicly admit he was wrong and John was right. Herod seems to have been a vain and impetuous individual. So John remained in prison, out of sight of the public, but not out of Herod's mind. Then came Herod's birthday, and things took a strange and bloody change. Herod's underlings, the gospel says, his courtiers, officers, and leaders of Galilee, they threw a grand birthday celebration for him. And at the party was the daughter of Herodias. She would have been Herod's sort of not quite legal stepdaughter. And although she's not named in the Gospels, she would become known as the infamous Salome and is called by that name by the 1st century AD historian Josephus, who also recounts this story. She was a dancer, and I would imagine a very attractive young woman. At this party, she danced for her sort of not quite legal stepfather. And Herod was smitten by her, it seems. "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it," he told the girl. It was his party, but he was now the one handing out the presents. The gospel writer tells us that he solemnly swore to her, and that's a very important phrase. He solemnly swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half of my kingdom." Now that strikes me as a rather foolish thing to say. After all, he's not bribing her to dance for him. She already has danced for him. He got what he wanted. There's really no need to do this. But I would imagine we have here a case of a middle-aged man fawning over an attractive young woman, and he is not thinking logically. Well, the girl went out from the party to consult with her mother what she should request. The options were quite attractive to her, I'm sure. Half of a kingdom is nothing to sneeze at. But the girl's mother, Herodias, had other things on her mind. She did not like what John the Baptist had said about Herod, or I would imagine about her either. She craved her position and power, and she would not have some wild-looking preacher rebuke her. Herodias wanted revenge. When her daughter asked her, "What should I ask for?" Mom replied, "The head of John the Baptizer." Now, if you were the daughter who had half of a kingdom dangling in front of you with all the power and prestige it would bring, how would you respond to your mother's request? I think I would have said, "But Mom, I can have half the kingdom. Just think of what that means." But she did not. She obeyed her mother. She immediately, one of Mark's favorite words in his gospel, she immediately rushed back to Herod and said, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." Now, Mom didn't say this. The daughter added the platter part, perhaps for dramatic effect. Shakespeare is sometimes giving credit for the line that revenge is a dish best served cold, but we all know from the movie Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, that is actually an old Klingon proverb. Whatever the case, for Herodias' daughter, revenge was best served on a silver platter. At this point in the story, Herod is overcome with remorse. Mark's gospel tells us the king was deeply grieved, but he had sworn a solemn oath in front of all those at his party. He had given his word to the girl. And for him to go back now to revoke his solemn pledge to her, even to save John's life, would have been a loss of face for him, and it would have also put him in the position of being someone whose words his followers might doubt. After all, if he would lie to his wife's daughter, he might certainly lie to them. So Herod did not hesitate. Immediately, and there's that word again, immediately he sent a soldier to the dungeon where John was beheaded. John, the prophet of the Lord, and someone who was innocent, died in an act of political expediency. The girl took John's head resting on that platter and gave it to her mother. And the story ends with some of John's followers coming to claim his body and placing it in a tomb. And there are echoes of later stories of Jesus and the one we hear this week. In chapter 8 of Mark's Gospel, Jesus asked his disciples as they travel in the area of Caesarea Philippi, where Herod's palace stood, Jesus asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" The responses of his disciples reflect what people said about Jesus to King Herod in this week's Gospel. And they answered him, that's Jesus, well, John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. It's only after Jesus asked his disciple Peter that Peter says, "You are the Messiah." After Peter said this, Jesus spoke for the first time of his coming suffering, rejection, arrest, and death. Jesus had to understand that if he continued to preach a message similar to John's, and if he continued to challenge the governing powers, he ran the risk of facing the same fate as John. If he kept up his God-given work, he would probably die as well. In Luke 13, there's a story of some Pharisees coming to warn Jesus of this very thing. They told him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." Jesus fearlessly responded, "Go and tell that fox for me. Listen, I am casting out demons and performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I finish my work," meaning he would die on the third day. In Luke's gospel account of Jesus' trial and arrest, Herod and Jesus actually have a face-to-face meeting. Herod happened to be in Jerusalem when Jesus was arrested. When Pontius Pilate finds out that Jesus was from Galilee and one of Herod's subjects, he sent him to Herod. The gospel tells us, when Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he'd been wanting to see him for a long time because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some signs. But Jesus would not even speak to Herod when he stood before him. Herod sent him back to Pilate, and as Luke tells us, that same day Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this day they had been enemies. At least Jesus was able to bring them together. And just as some of John's followers claimed his body and buried it, so some of Jesus' followers would do the same thing with him after his crucifixion. You see, Jesus and John were intimately linked in life and in death. Both died bravely, showing complete obedience to God, in stark contrast to the rulers of their nation. So thanks for watching our video this week, and I hope you get a good message from the sermon that Deaconess Ruth, will preach this week. God's blessings to you.